Of course, darling, that's what you can have. But I'm gonna buy you a Kawasaki. Of course, darling, I'm gonna ride away. That's what you can have. That no one can against that. So come on, of course, darling, that's right. That's what you can have. That you're gonna drive away. Of course, darling, no one can against that. So come on, of course, darling, you know that there are many people after us. But they can't, of course, darling, that's what you can have. What you want, of course, darling, that's what you can have. That we are what we want, of course, darling, that's what you can have. That we are so fine. Of course, darling, that's what you can have. That we're gonna drive away. Of course, darling, that's what you can have. They went around. Of course, darling, let's show them how we do it. Of course, darling, that's what you can have. That they're after us, but they can't. Of course, darling, that's what you can have. That I'm gonna show you how to drive. Of course, darling, that's what you can say. That we are gonna win everything we want. Of course, darling, that's what you can have. Of course, you're on blue. Of course, darling, that's what you can have. That no one can against us, of course, darling, after my money, even the crown after my money, of course, darling, they are crazy, of course, darling, but I'm gonna show you, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that no one can against us, that they are after us, of course, darling, that's what you can have, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that they always find you and you pretender, of course, darling, let them go. That they can't against us, of course, darling, that's what you can have. That you're gonna drive, and you're gonna drive, and can, of course, darling, that's what you can have. That no one can against us, that they are searching for us, but they can't, of course, darling. Of course, darling, even the crown after my money, of course, darling, what can you do against that? Just nothing, of course, that is what you can have, that they can't against me, that is what you can have, that they're after my money, they're after my alcohol, but of course, darling, that them there, of course, darling, they can't against me, we're gonna drive away, of course, darling, that is what you can have. That I'm rich, of course, darling, and they all after my diamonds, of course, darling, all my diamonds are missing, but that's what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that I'm gonna buy a Kawasaki, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that you're gonna have Medusa moves, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that no one can against us, so come on, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that you're gonna enjoy the time, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you're gonna drive away, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are all after us, but they can't, of course, darling, we're gonna get sorry and so don't neglect, of course, darling, you know that we're on the capital letters and that you have to let me cross and let's see if I Christopher pyramid, you have to let them talk, that is what you can have, of course, darling, that we're on capital letters and you have to let them both, of course, darling, we're gonna get sorry and so don't neglect, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna drive like no one can, of course, darling, that is what you can say, that no one can against us, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna go where no one can find us, of course, darling, they are after us, but they can't, of course, darling, that is what you can say, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that's what you can have, that I'm gonna buy you a Kawasaki, of course, darling, that's what you can have, that no one can against us, It's gonna find us, of course, darling, that is what you gonna have to do. You're gonna turn them on, of course, darling, that is what you gonna have to do. You're gonna turn them into stone, of course, darling, that is what you gonna have. But no one against us, of course, darling, the king is after my money, of course, darling, but you can't against us. That is what you gonna have to do. Darling, you know why this yours with the draft letter. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That word is yours, of course, darling, and you have to let them all. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That no one can find proper. That word is yours, and you know that, of course, darling, that you have to let them all. Of course, darling, I try to cash, but they can't. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. There is only a way to make cash, of course, darling, that is what you can have. And that's what you have to do, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna drive, and nobody's gonna find us, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna be the fastest, of course, darling, that is what you can have. Against us, of course, darling, that is what you can see, so come on, of course, darling. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that all my diamonds are missing, that is what you can have, of course, even the king wants my money, of course, darling, even the king wants my money, what is happening, of course, darling, that is what you can have, but that is impossible, that I catch something, everyone king is after my money, of course, darling, that is what you can have, but I have my bitches counting diamonds, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna buy a Kawasaki, of course, darling, and no one can against that, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against that, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can see, that I'm gonna drive like no one can, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we are gonna steal, that we are gonna rob, that we are gonna have everything we want, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, that we are gonna find everything we want, of course, darling, that is what you can have, so come on, of course, darling, you wanna Kawasaki, then let's ride, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us, that we are gonna rob everything we want, of course, darling, and no one is gonna find us, that is what you can have, of course, darling, that is what you can see, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that we're gonna be the fastest, that is what you can have, against us, of course, darling, that is what you can see, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that even the king is after my money, but I'm not gonna give him a single cent, of course, darling, I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one. Of course, darling, I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, I can swear you that, of course, darling, that's what you can see, that no one can against us, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that word is yours, and I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, that is what you can have, so come on, of course, darling, that is what you can see, don't do bitch, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, from boo boo boo, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that even the king is after my money, that is what you can have, from boo boo boo, of course, darling, that is what you to know that you have to let them all who fall that door. Course, of course, darling, that is what chicken heart, of course, darling, same place, of course, darling, that's what chicken have. That world is yours, and that I'm not gonna give a single cent to no one, of course, darling, that's what chicken house, that you have to let them, of course, darling, that is what chicken have. So it's life, of course, darling, don't give a single cent to no one, of course, darling, that's what chicken have, that no one can against us. So come on, of course, darling, that is what chicken have, of course, darling, that we are gonna have everything we want. Of course, darling, that is what chicken have. I can show you that you're gonna have everything we want. Of course, darling, kiss and bye. I love you so much.